Obama strongly recommitted the United States to closing Guantanamo, and he took that occasion to announce that one of the steps would be to appoint a new special envoy for Guantanamo closure. Cliff was appointed soon after that, and he began work here at the department on July 1st, 2013. Please welcome Mr. Clifford Sloan. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Good morning. It is a real privilege and a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Everybody in this room knows the reasons for closing Guantanamo. And one of those reasons, the toll that Guantanamo takes on our international standing, the people in this room know better than anybody in the world. And the president put this succinctly. And he said that Guantanamo should be closed because it has become, and I quote, a propaganda tool for our enemies and a distraction for our allies. The president who said that was President George W. Bush. And that's at page 180 of his memoir. Now, as you know, President Obama has very strongly called for the closing of the Guantanamo detention facility. And as Hans mentioned, in his speech at the National Defense University on May 23rd of last year, he very forcefully renewed and reiterated his commitment and determination to close Guantanamo. And I'm pleased to report to you that we have been able to make progress, and we're continuing to make very significant progress in three different areas. First, we've gotten foreign transfers going again after a period when they were largely frozen and stuck. Second, we successfully worked with Congress and changed the law to remove unnecessary, burdensome obstacles to foreign transfers. And third, with regard to those individuals at Guantanamo who are not now approved for transfer, we have started a new administrative proceeding in which they are given a new opportunity, a fresh opportunity, to show that they now should be approved for transfer. And I'm also pleased to report to you that we're going to get it done. We're going to close Guantanamo. Now, I'm not Pollyannish, and I am very well aware of the challenges, of the difficulties, very well aware of the fact that this issue has had a troubled history as we've tried to grapple with Guantanamo. But recognizing and fully appreciating all of that, which is very important, I can tell you that Guantanamo can be closed, Guantanamo needs to be closed, and Guantanamo will be closed. Now, what I'd like to do this morning is to briefly give you a snapshot and an overview of the current situation at Guantanamo. I'd like to explain to you the three areas that I mentioned in which we're making very significant progress, and I'd like to ask you for your help as we move forward on this issue. Let me start with a snapshot of the current situation at Guantanamo. There are 154 detainees at Guantanamo now. There have been close to 800 people that have gone through Guantanamo as detainees at one time or another. At its height, there were close to 700 detainees there at one time. As I'm sure you know, Guantanamo was opened in January 2002. There are detainees at Guantanamo who have been there more than 12 years. There are many who have been there for almost 12 years. Of the 154 who are there, exactly half, 77, have been approved for transfer, and exactly half, 77, have not been approved for transfer. Now, one point I want to highlight is what this means when I say approved for transfer, because I think it's very important to understand, and I think it's something that frequently has gotten lost in the discussion and in the tumult over Guantanamo. You will recall that at the beginning of President Obama's term, he ordered a review of every individual at Guantanamo. And there was a very intensive review. And for somebody to be approved for transfer, it required the unanimous approval of 6 departments and agencies: the State Department, the Defense Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Justice Department, the Homeland Security Department, and the Director of National Intelligence all had to unanimously approve somebody for transfer. And everything was looked at about this individual, all the facts that were available, including everything about the circumstances of his detention. It was a very, very careful, exhaustive process, and there were many that were not approved for transfer. It was a rigorous process, and it has stood the test of time. Now, as I mentioned, 77 have not been approved for transfer. And of those 77, 10 are facing criminal charges in the military commission system. Either they're facing criminal charges like the 9/11 co-conspirators, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or they're serving sentences for offenses that have been adjudicated in the military commission system. So that's the current situation at Guantanamo. Let me turn now to the three areas in which we have been making substantial progress. First, foreign transfers. And as I mentioned, transfers have been largely frozen or stuck for 2 to 3 years, and that is after the terrific work of Dan Freed and many people in this room in 2009 and 2010, which resulted in 67 people being transferred from Guantanamo, but then for 2 to 3 years, almost nobody moved from Guantanamo. And in the last several months, we've been able to transfer 12 people from Guantanamo. Now, all the transfers are subject to appropriate security and humane treatment assurances, and some are repatriation to the country where the person is national, and some are resettlements if that's not available because of security or humane treatment concerns. But we have been able to transfer 12, and I'm very pleased to tell you there are more transfers in the pipeline. Stay tuned. You will be seeing transfers. We are very active on that front, and you will be seeing more coming soon. Second, we changed the law to remove the unnecessary, burdensome obstacles to foreign transfers. And this was in December, the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which is the principal place in the law where the restrictions on Guantanamo transfers live. And the current standard with the new NDAA is that the Secretary of Defense has to give Congress at least 30 days notice before a transfer from Guantanamo. And he has to make a determination that actions have been taken or will be taken to substantially mitigate the risk that the individual will engage or re-engage in terrorism or other hostile activities against the United States or United States persons or interests. Now, previous versions of the law had many more requirements, are very burdensome and cumbersome, and they also had words like guarantee or ensure instead of substantially mitigate the risk. We think this is a very clear, straightforward standard. We advocated very strongly for it, and we're very pleased that we were able to get it adopted. And I will say our preference would be no restrictions at all. We think they're unnecessary and counterproductive, but we very strongly favor this change in the law. Now, there's another set of restrictions which relates to transfers to the United States as opposed to transfers to other countries. And the current law has a ban on transfers to the United States of anybody from Guantanamo for any person. And the Senate bill last year, Chairman Levin's bill from the Senate Armed Services Committee, changed the law on foreign transfers in the way that I described, and it also would have changed the ban on transfers to the United States. It would have permitted transfers for emergency medical conditions or for detention and trial. The House bill, in contrast, kept all of the current restrictions, actually added a few. And the agreement between the Senate and the House was that it took the Senate language on foreign transfers, but it maintained the ban on transfers to the United States. So we have work to do there. We're going to be very active working on that this year, and it's going to be a very high priority. Just a couple more points about this change in the law that I want to highlight, which is that, first of all, when this bill came up on the floor of the Senate, there was an amendment that was offered to basically track the House bill, impose all of the current restrictions, and also add a few restrictions. And it's the kind of amendment that has been passing in Congress in the last 2-3 years. And it was defeated on the floor of the Senate, 55 to 43. And that was very important as a substantive matter because it led to the change in foreign transfers language that's very important. but I think it also is very important as a sign of momentum and progress on this issue. And there is a growing recognition and consensus, what everyone thought about Guantanamo in the past, that it is time to turn the page and move on. And you can see that in that comment from President Bush's memoir that I mentioned. Many of President Bush's top former counterterrorism officials, foreign policy officials, defense officials, all think we need to close the chapter on Guantanamo and move on. And you can see that in the vote and in the momentum that we have in the Senate and in the Congress on it. And in addition, one point I want to highlight is that there was a new argument that really got traction, I think particularly in the Senate consideration, which has to do with the cost of Guantanamo. We had new figures that showed that the cost of Guantanamo is $2.7 million each year for each detainee who's there. And that doesn't even count hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure improvement that would be required if you were going to say, let's really keep this open for several years and make it a place that we're viewing as at least semi-permanent. Now, I will tell you that I sat with senators who previously had been opposed to closing Guantanamo or had been undecided about it. And when they saw those cost figures, they just said, this makes no sense at this point in our history to be spending that kind of money. And in comparison, at our supermax prisons, which is at the high end of detention costs, it costs $78,000 per prisoner per year, compared to $2.7 million per detainee each year. So that's going to be an important priority for us as we move forward this year. And the third point that I want to emphasize is the progress that we've been making with regard to the individuals who are not approved for transfer. Now, as I mentioned, 10 of the 77 not approved for transfer are facing criminal charges or serving sentences. Of the other 67 who are not approved for transfer, not facing criminal charges, we started a new proceeding. It's called the Periodic Review Board, in which the detainee is given an opportunity to show that continued detention is not necessary because he does not present a significant security threat to the United States. He's provided a personal representative by the government. He also has an option to have private counsel, and as you may know, many of the detainees have pro bono lawyers who've been representing them in habeas corpus proceedings and related proceedings. We've had 5 of the proceedings so far. The results of 3 of them have been made public. In 2 of the 3, the person who had not been approved for transfer now has been approved for transfer. 1 of the 3 was not approved for transfer, but he has an opportunity to reapply in 6 months. And so we are moving forward on that as well. Every one of the 67 in that category will receive a hearing in this new process, and it illustrates that across the board we're moving forward. With the 77 who are approved for transfer, we're working as hard as we can to get transfer agreements in place and to transfer them. And with those not approved for transfer, who are not facing criminal charges, there's this new administrative proceeding. Now, as I mentioned, I want to ask you for your help because, as I also mentioned, you have a very distinctive and important perspective and voice on this issue. And when I started on July 1st, an important priority for me and people working with me was to reach out to many organizations and individuals who had been very active in the public debate and discourse about closing Guantanamo, and who had gotten very discouraged with how the issue had progressed, and to some extent had withdrawn from the discourse and the debate. And so, for example, I met with the group of former senior military officials who had played a very important role in 2009 in strongly calling for Guantanamo to be closed from their perspective as former senior military officials. And one of the things we emphasize to them is there is a new era of possibility. We can get this done. We don't want to relitigate the past. We want to move forward and turn the page on Guantanamo. And at the end of the meeting, one of the leaders of that group of former military officials said, well, I guess it's time for us to return to the field. And they played a very important role. And Senator McCain, in his floor statement in support of Chairman Levin's bill, which again changed it both on foreign transfers and removed the ban on transfers to the United States, and Senator McCain gave a very strong floor statement supporting the bill in its entirety. And he began his statement by quoting at length from those former senior military officials who had met with him. And we met with religious groups who had been very, very active in 2009 and 2010, and who had a very important, distinctive perspective. And once again, they were very energized and participated again in the debate. And that's true also of other organizations and individuals. And so, as I say, people in this room have a very, very important perspective on this issue, and I urge you to make it be heard. And that brings me to my last point, which is a personal point, which is that I previously worked in the federal government in a few places, and I've also had many positions in the private sector. And I can tell you that I have never been as impressed with a group of men and women as I have been with the people at the State Department, in the Foreign Service, and the Civil Service. And I have had the opportunity and the pleasure, and I mean that sincerely, to work with many people in this building and in embassies around the world. And I've been uniformly very impressed by their insight, their expertise, their commitment, their dedication, their public service. And they are building on the legacy that you established. And they are living up to the culture of quality and excellence that you built. So I thank you for that, and I thank you very, very much for the opportunity to be here this morning. And